very tall, slender young woman.
We're running. I think.
All right.
Yeah, we're running. Okay.
We're looking at the last two tests and profiles of the action section of the profile index, which are number 14, the application test, and number 15, the phase test. These two profiles are usually of much less significance than the first action profiles. Often almost negligible, but sometimes they're important. Now, when I was trying to put together how to present them, I realized that several things beyond astrology need elucidation. As we have mentioned a number of times, there is a God in the making behind every horoscope. And that means that the being within is ultimately capable of comprehending anything. But there's usually a gap or a differential between what a person is ultimately capable of and what they are presently capable of. And there's no means except a very deep and well-trained clairvoyance that you can determine the current evolutionary stance of anyone. We do tend to have prejudices and people we don't like or who have a different character from our own. We like to say that they're not highly evolved. But we can determine to some extent the evolutionary status by watching what they do and what they're capable of. But if someone is a Down's child, that's a temporary condition for one life. And they're not, not a lot we can say about that. Now, other cases are not so obvious. Sometimes it pays, if you're working with someone with a horoscope, it pays to sit down and have a conversation. And have a kind of conversation that touches on subjects that will indicate how advanced a person is in terms of evolution. What I often do is focus on the person, on the individuality behind the horoscope, and then start talking. And I don't try to do it all with my conscious mind, because if you develop a rapport with someone, deeper things will come out of you with some people than would come out with other people. And those are people that are usually have a higher evolutionary status, even though the external, the externals don't indicate that. So this is the situation then, that the native is more advanced than you might think. Because this is important, because a horoscope has to be looked at differently depending on the evolutionary status of the individual. So this is why there is no really set way to approach a horoscope and its owner. Because if somebody is highly evolved, you have to treat it differently than if they aren't. Now, we're learning a means to come to a pretty deep and comprehensive, I think this is going to take no more than 3 years to get through this course. So we're learning a pretty deep and comprehensive way of understanding a horoscope. But what is required in a session with somebody might only be 1 or 2 little things to get the grasp of it all. Now, most people are not going to go deeply into most horoscopes. If you're married to someone, or if they're your child or something like that, then you're likely to have to go deep in order to understand all the things that are going on. But most people that you meet, you're not going to do that. So what we're doing in this class is something that is not the normal run-of-the-mill use of astrology for the way we use it. So from all of this, it comes to the fact that two people may have the same horoscope, and each one might have to be treated differently. And it means that we have to adapt ourselves to be many things to many people, the way St. Paul said it. I think to say it in another way, we have to become Neptunian chameleons in order to adapt to many different people. Now, having said all of that, I'm going to reverse myself and hope it doesn't frustrate you. A street musician approaches music differently from a composer. Say a composer is working in a conservatory. For someone who is amusical, they approach music not at all and may not even be capable of it. And it's like that way with evolution. Some people are capable of planning out a life or creating a life for themselves. But nobody is left in a lurch. Some people who don't have that capability, they're not stranded, and they don't go aimlessly through evolution, being carried along by the tide, because their lives do have meaning, and they have a direction, and they have a structure to them. And that's not an accident. In modern Western mysticism, we claim that there are beings that are called recording angels. And recording angels are beings of a very high order. And they have a grasp of both destiny and of the evolutionary direction and purpose behind it that is almost perfect compared to our understanding. And what they do is the people who are not fit for themselves to create a good life, it is they work collaboratively with the recording angels, and they find times and places of birth that are optimally suitable for them. And sometimes the lives of a person who's not capable of planning it out are better thought out lives than the life of somebody who is a journeyman creator. Because when you first start doing creation, you're not so great at it. And you make mistakes, you plan your life in a wrong way. So, even the life of what seems to be an evolutionary backward person can have a surprising amount of astrological organization behind it. The thing in all of this is we just can't make any assumptions. We have to be on our toes all the time, and we have to be watchful because we'll be surprised. All right. Now it's time to get to profile number 14, the application profile. Now, Bob doesn't have one of these, I think, either from last year. These are what we're using to understand 14 and 15. Do you have one of those? Mm-hmm. You do? Okay. All right. I didn't remember whether you were here last time. No, you recovered pretty well. You look healthy already.
Yeah, it was rough.
All right. Now it's time to get the feel for number 14 and 15. I grew up on a small farm in east central Wisconsin. And my father was an orphan. And he had only a few step relatives and friends in Milwaukee. My mother, on the other hand, came from a family where there were 10 children. And they lived on poor land in northern Wisconsin, near Coleman, Wisconsin, if you know where that is. That land was given to the lumber barons so that they would harvest it. And when they harvested the land, they were free to sell it. But in that part of the state, upper Michigan and northeastern Wisconsin, it's basically granite. And on top of granite, there's sand. And then there's a thin layer of topsoil. So basically, in terms of farming, the land was worthless. So what they did is they sold it to unsuspecting and not too bright Eastern Europeans, which is my roots. You run into a lot of people up there, Banazaks and people like that come from that background. Now, because my father was an orphan, he was a very good father to us. He spent all kinds of time with the kids. And he loved that big family. So what happened was that when the weather got warm enough so that we wouldn't be stuck in the snow, we would go to visit my grandparents and the extended family up around Coleman. It was a trip of about 75 miles at most. But when you have 3 children in the car, it's a lot of fussing and squabbling that goes on. We played horses a lot. And from these trips, at a very early age, I became aware of the relativity of time. I knew from my experience that it took longer to get to Grandma's house than it did to get home. And eventually, it became generalized in my consciousness, and I saw that it was took much longer to get anywhere than it did to come home. And really, it wasn't a matter of getting somewhere or getting home that causes the relativity of time. It's about the same amount of time whether you're coming or going, except if we ran into a Packers game. then it was slow. But it's a matter of anticipation. We anticipate being somewhere, and that anticipation produces attention, and it seems to take forever before your anticipation is going to be fulfilled. So what the application profile is all about is about anticipation and aftermath. And both can be pleasant and both can be unpleasant. It can be like a mounting excitement that a child has before its birthday, or it can be a dread of a coming event, like the first killing frost in your garden. You know it's coming any day, and you dread it. You know, so it goes either way. Separation may be replete with all kinds of afterthoughts and insights after the anticipation is over, or it may be a letdown or a disappointment. So those sorts of things are what we're looking at here. There are many different potential interpretations, but that should give you enough to get the basic feel. You know, it's a funny thing. In my older ages now, getting home takes longer than getting somewhere, because I'm an introvert and I want to get away from people as much as possible. It seems to take a long time to get home. And you have social obligations you have to meet, and it drags to get there. All right. So this is a population test, just like all the other tests. You count the number of applying aspects and the number of separating aspects. Let's see. This is the other thing this is a aspects table that we made from the horoscopes that we had, and that's what we're using for all of these tests and profiles. In Freud, there is an 8 applying and 2 separating. Now that's a pretty very standout. It's nowhere near average. And in the conspectus line, I put in an anticipatory stance toward action. And that's, knowing Freud, that was very good, because his anticipation is what opened up his intuition. And he was very, very much an intuitive person. And you can see that this stance of consciousness was sort of inviting to the intuition. You even see that if you go to Pentecostal meetings. People put themselves in the position, I have a feeling there's going to be a miracle that happens tonight, and that anticipation actually brings it about. Now, Freud did study history, and he was a very ardent historian, and he took very detailed case histories, but he was not by any means a nostalgiac. He was too much of an evolutionary free thinker for that. And all the way until the last week of his life, he was always improving and innovating and adding to psychoanalysis. And those are things that are pretty good indications of this constant mounting, constant building up throughout life. Now in Jung, profile number 14 ends up being a 6 applying and 3 separating. Now that's not quite as dramatic as the Freud profile, but it's still more unusual, higher than usual. The standard would be 1 to 1, and this is 2 to 1, so it's actually a doubled population. Jung continued to take on new studies throughout life. Jung was as much or more of a scholar than he was a practicing psychologist. After a while, he didn't have as many patients. Freud had them all the way to the very last day of his life. So in the conspectus line, I wrote, always anticipating and then moving on to the next new thing. When there were changes in his life, it wasn't a matter of him having to be pushed out of the nest of the past where you're secure. He did have the drive to do the next new thing. He even strained at times to get at new things. A really good example from his personal life is for years he was head of psychiatry in the Berg-Holzli mental sanatorium, which is the largest sanatorium in Switzerland. And it was required that he live with his entire family in apartments that were there for the doctors. And he was highly anticipating moving out and getting into a private home, and that's that was that sort of a thing. Always looking forward to the next conference or whatever like that. All right. Number 15 is the phase profile, and that's usually the least significant of all of the action profiles. It is also many times abstract in nature. And when it is meaningful, it is about applied intention. I don't know how to say it any other way. All right, to get at it is a little bit difficult. Let's take a topic that we're actually studying in the other class, rebirth. In terms of rebirth, a lifetime can be seen like one bead on a necklace. It is a beautiful bead, but its relationship to the bead before it and the bead after gives a greater meaning. You know, the strand that it's on. And if it's one of those multi-strand necklaces, then the whole even the strand itself has to relate to the other strands of the necklace. And that's sort of like what we have to do in our consciousness to understand rebirth. We have to understand it in terms of something that's ongoing over a very long period of time. And obviously, if you have something like a Down's baby, that's the way you have to treat it. This is a temporary timeout. You can't say that that person has always been very backward and incapable of appreciating the material world. You can't say that. But, you know, it's like a timeout. Now, most reliable researchers into rebirth and destiny claim that quite a bit of the stuff of our future lives is already in place. Some say that plans, that we are laying plans, whether we realize it or not, for the next 2 or 3 and sometimes even 4 lives after this one. Now, anything can be changed and anything can be changed at any time. And we can always set in motion something new that changes it all. But we have a long history behind us of many rebirths. And from that we have a residual character. And if you have a residual character, it's not easy to radically change direction. It's going to take several lives, you know. So, all right, we are divine beings, we're gods in the making, and we have all kinds of capacity, but we don't always, or aren't always able to express it all, and therefore we have to stretch it out over several lives. I forget who the author was, but an author was trying to make a point about rebirth, and he quoted an acrostic. If you know what an acrostic is where you take the first letter in each word down, and you put them together and they make a sentence. Or sometimes you take the first word and put it together and it makes a sentence. And this particular acrostic was one that said, earlier across the sea, I did this kind of poetry, and now I'm doing this. You know, like a saying, like it was saying to the world, if you were capable of picking up the acrostic, that this person remembered a previous life in a different literary art form and was letting the world know about it. Now, this is not unusual, that a person might stay in something like literary arts for several lives in a row. Richard Wagner is said by some clairvoyants to have, in his previous rebirth, had been Sophocles. And there's a good 2,000 years in between there. So there was probably another rebirth, and I'll bet you in that rebirth in between, he learned to write music so that he could do the whole business. Write the drama, because he didn't call those operas, he called them musical dramas. And because in Greek times, these were usually at the Dionysia. I don't know whether at the greater or the lesser Dionysia, that the competitions, poetry competitions for drama were put on. But the playwrights were all Ionians. But and I don't know why it was set up this way, but the musicians were Dorians. and they fought among each other a lot. It was like the whole Peloponnesian War over the creation of a drama. And so you could see why he would want to learn music in between. Now, this kind of progressive development over the span of several rebirths is not limited to a pursuit of a profession like the arts or something like that. It applies to character building and to life itself. Suppose, for example, a person is trying to develop courage, and it's that characteristic that is most important and not necessarily the profession. So that person might in one life be a warrior, and then in the next life might be a sacrificial martyr, and then yet somebody else be reborn again as somebody who has to have intellectual courage and has to stand up to an intellectually corrupt system and argue it all out. So what we're talking about is a development over a long period of time. Now, between any two planets, there is an actual or a virtual cycle which shows a actual or virtual stage of development in the item or in the thing that the two of them, the work that the two of them do. It's a cycle. The most common one we use is the lunation cycle. The lunation, a new moon is built until it becomes full, and then it is broken down and the light is fed back to the sun. And so it's always a cycle of building and destruction or something similar to destruction. And the phases, like the phases of the moon, or the phases are part of a binary cycle, like the handout that I just gave you. Now, anytime two planets are in aspect with each other, they are at some stage of a cycle. But the cycle isn't always obvious like the cycle of the moon. So you have to look at it by the geometric relationship, which is virtual and not necessarily by picturing it like the moon. Now, just because somebody has a second square between Mars and Mercury, it doesn't mean that they have gone through all the aspects of Mars and Mercury to get to that square. It just means that they're developing intellectual courage and composure in the face of argument or in the face of conflict of some kind or another. It's possible that they may have worked on courage in a different way, or they may have worked on honesty in a different way in the past. And you can see this is all virtual and all abstract. But when you're tracing something like this, you have to think about it like musical composition. Like take a Beethoven symphony. He may introduce a theme, and he'll put that theme through all kinds of twists and turns, invert it and things like that, and then he'll set it aside. And then 2 or 3 movements later, he'll take up that theme again, and he'll blend it together with everything that has transpired in between. And so, because somebody has Mars square Mercury in that second square doesn't necessarily mean that they have been arguing all along. It may be now that it is the time that they're calling back something from several lives past. So this is why it's important important that when we look at a horoscope that we don't think that it's a linear activity, and that we don't think that it is exactly like the way we see cycles happening in the heavens. It's something virtual, it's something abstract, which means that we have to be humble before rebirth, because it is way, way, way too much to figure it out with a simple mind, unless you have a higher kind of consciousness and you can see those things over a long period of time, you're not likely to understand everything in a simplistic way. All right. So the phase of any aspect is as if it were in a continuous and ongoing cycle. And it is in that way that the phase is used. Now, when we apply this test, number 15, to the horoscope of Sigmund Freud, we get complete balance, 5 and 5. And my conspectus reads, balance, not much can be said. So even me with my long-windedness have not too much to say about it. So this is not quite like the attitude tests. Balance here means something else. It means balance of action and not psychological balance of attitude. This is about how someone sets out to do things, and in phase. Now this phase aspect test may not be significant in a lot of charts, especially if there's complete balance. But sometimes it proves to be very significant. The best example, it just blew me away when I saw it, is in the horoscope of George Armstrong Custer. And every phase, every planet and every aspect in that planet is in the second or destructive phase. And even if there is a conflict about what time of the day he was born, things are set up in such a way that no matter what time of the day he was born, it was still going to be all destructive aspect. It's, something like that is significant, but you're not going to get something that obviously significant all the time. All right, if we look at the phase test of Carl Jung, we get something that is standout. We get a 2-7. And this is revealing, but it may not be necessarily easy to understand. My conspective reads definitely a trend toward deconstruction in actions. I didn't say destruction. Deconstruction is something different than destruction. Deconstruction is taking something apart and seeing how its parts work relative to itself. It usually relates to theories. And for both Freud and Jung, the way they saw the unconscious or the total psychology of a human being was a theory. Neither of them could place it anywhere in space-time. They said that there is this unconscious and it's an entity, and they were sure of that from their observations or observations of the things that issued from it. But where it was, Freud, when he was early on, tried to relate it neurologically and couldn't do it at all. Jung could have put it objectively because he was on the fringes of clairvoyance, but he avoided doing that altogether because he did not want to be seen as a mystic, because he wanted to be accepted by material science. And so he just let it hang in the air. A lot of his ideas are like that. His whole idea of, what's serendipity? The coincidences. What? His whole philosophy of coincidences. Synchronicity. That's floating in space, and it has nothing to do with destiny. It just happens to do with a very, very convenient parallelism. All right. Analytical psychology is the name that Jung called his psychology, as opposed to psychoanalysis, which is Freud's. And both of them are analysis, because they probe and they take things apart. And both theorize about the nature of the unconscious. And neither of them can do it in terms of complete empiricism, because that would be clairvoyance. Freud was amazingly intuitive, so intuitive that people thought he was a mind reader. And he used his theory as a means to focus his intuition. And it doesn't necessarily mean that his theory was true, but that his theory paralleled something that was true, and that in trusting it in himself and anticipating is the way he opened up his intuitiveness. His theory was based on materialistic Darwinism, and his idea about the unconscious was that, you know, everything in the unconscious is basically very primitive. It is very instinctual, and he has no idea of anything spiritual. And when he talks about things spiritual, it's almost like a slap in the face when he talks about those poor people that have faith about things spiritual or things like that. You know, talk about being put down. Wow. All right. So because of his material blindness, Freud was incapable of getting a good read on the unconsciousness. However, he was intellectually honest, and he knew all the weak points in his theory, and he points them out. And he says, we're hoping that future research in psychoanalysis is going to answer these questions. All right. The situation with Jung is both similar and different. He can't locate the unconsciousness cosmographically, but he does deconstruct all cases in terms of his theory, just like Freud did. However, his philosophy is much more elaborate, and in some ways it comes very close to the findings of mysticism. But he read a lot of mysticism, both ancient and contemporary, but he never quotes it, except he quotes it only in a scholarly sense. So late in life, he said he wished he may have pursued some of these things when it was clear that he wasn't going to be doing anything more in life, and that what he said now wouldn't make any difference as to whether analytic psychology would be accepted or not. He said he wished he had gone into them, and Freud said he wished he had studied parapsychology, and if he had it to do all over again, he would. Now, it's possible, though I wouldn't put it forth, I wouldn't posit it in any way, that all of his metapsychology or his speculation was a deconstruction of mysticism and put into terms that had a consistency psychologically to him. And it's possible that he may not even have been conscious of it, but he does seem to get very irritable when about mystics altogether. The historical ones he doesn't get down on. All right, but at any rate, my guess is that probably in a past life he was mystically inclined and did aspire to mystical development and becoming a outright clairvoyant or darling of God or something like that. This is a lot of speculation, but understanding, because reading Carl Jung is both a frustration and a great joy. Because every new thing that you go into, it's really interesting. He thinks about things that most people don't think about. But the conclusions that he comes to, at least in print, are frustrating because they're so materialized. All right, let's look at the last two tests and profiles here. We're looking at number 16 and number 17. Now, these profiles are not meant to be like the other profiles. They are a matter of relative focus. We're trying to get a big picture here. There's we're saying very broad things about the time of birth and what that does to the nature of character. The other profiles are broad also compared to doing an analysis as we're going to do later on, but this is even far more broad. In fact, if you look at the sheet, at the profile index, number 1 should actually be something like number 15. It should be, remember the Gestalt. The Gestalt is basically a focus test, and that it should be there. But I don't know, when I formed the sheets and went through all of this, I didn't think it out thoroughly enough. And I'm sorry that I didn't do that. I think about reproducing or reconstructing it and putting the Gestalt where it belongs, but it's getting a little bit late in the day to do that, so it may come out in some future edition. I don't know. All right. The idea between the tests and profile number 16, the agreement test and profile. This is an idea that's many centuries old. In Western philosophy, it was first stated with strong influence by Aristotle. And this is a way of thinking a human being is comprised of body, soul, and spirit. And in this context, the body means the dense physical body and nothing more. The soul does not mean what we mean when we say somebody is soulful, that they have a lot of accrued experience. Nor does it mean the individuality, like when we say he's an old soul, or does a dog have a soul? Neither of those are what it means. It means everything between the spirit, which is the divine focus, and the dense physical body. And in terms of mysticism, that would include the etheric vital body, the desire body, and the concrete mind. And taken all together, they are what is called soul. All are extremely subtle, and all are extremely fluid. But none of them is the ultimate mover. The ultimate mover is the self. It is the spiritual ego. It is the identity. So the way we're looking at it in terms of mysticism, the spirit is represented by the sun. The ego, both the true and the pseudo-ego, is represented by the sun. The inner identity, or the individuality, is ruled by the sun. In this broad context of this test, the soul is represented by the moon. And it is the moon in astrology that carries out all astrological activity and finalizes it. And the dense physical body in this test and profile is indicated by the ascendant. Now, this is not something new to the history of astrology. The sun, moon, and ascendant have been used going all the way back to at least al-Biruni, the great Arabic astrologer, what we call the part of fortune, which is the ability to make something manifest, is a formula dependent on the sun, the moon, and the ascendant. Also, the Heilig points. There are places in the horoscope for sun or moon to be located, and they indicate health points or ill health points. So what we're trying to do with this test and profile is we're trying to find whether there is a basic harmony and consistency that runs vertically through the character. So the examples are the best way to get to it. The highest consistency and total harmony would be if you had sun, conjoined moon, conjoined ascendant, and sun and moon in the first house. That would mean that the inner person and the middle person and the outer person were all based in the very same principle. Now, if all three are in the same element, like all three in fire or all three in water, that is also pretty consistent. And even if all three are in positive or all three are in negative signs, there is consistency there. But beyond that, there are various degrees and especially various types of inconsistency. Suppose, for example, you have the sun and the moon in a positive sign, but the ascendant is in a negative sign. This is somebody that can initiate impulses and can bring them to the surface, but can't externalize them because the nature of the ascendant is such that it isn't really in agreement with what those impulses are. That's an extreme statement. So they become altered, and there's a certain amount of frustration in that. The same thing applies going the other direction. If there is a perception from, suppose Capricorn rising, very astute perception, but everything else is in air or fire or something like that, the data is not in a form that is copacetic with the transport of the information and the interpreter of the information. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't good things that come out of conflicted patterns. It just means that there are conflicts and that there are internal conflicts. Now, there are many, many different combinations, which we're not going to look into all of them, or that would almost be a talk in itself, and I'm not prepared to do that. I don't want to do it. Now, this is one of those quick hit kinds of things. You remember from time to time I've said that if somebody gives you a horoscope and you know you're going to see them only one time and you have only about 5 minutes to talk to them, you need a quick hit kind of thing. One of the common things that I use with a quick hit is the strongest positive versus the strongest negative aspect. This is another one. If you can see that there's a big difference between the inner, middle, or outer man, so that they aren't all harmoniously consistent with each other, you can address that, and that will immediately let the person know that you understand something of their life. All right, let's apply this to the horoscope of Sigmund Freud. And when we do that, the sun is in a negative sign, Taurus. The moon is in a positive sign, Gemini. And the ascendant is in a negative sign, Scorpio. So we have a negative person deep within and without, but the communication between them is not good. Fortunately, this is a very mild situation. So the moon is in a great place, being a Gemini, for fluid transportation, but it doesn't bear up to he has to repeat the observations many times, or he has to repeat the profundities many times. And it's a funny thing because a lot of the things that he says are very deep, but when he writes, they really are in Gemini fashion. They're not necessarily stated in a heavy way. And that was by intention in him, but you can see that there's this kind of a struggle. All right. Now, if we look at the horoscope of Carl Jung, the test yields sun is positive, moon is negative, and ascendant is positive. And the conspectives, this is the, it's a slowing transportation between the within and the without. And this is almost the inverse of the Freud profile. And in this one, in his life, it stands out much more clearly than the Freud. The primary function of the moon is transport, but the moon is in the third house, and it's in Taurus, which is a very heavy sign. And this is what it is with Carl Jung. He was a very, very deep and ponderous thinker, but not a good writer. And things become turgid and heavy, and they can be persuasive, but who wants to hang on to all of that long, heavy stuff? And, all right, at any rate, this is, he comes across, I think it's because of the leonine nature, as being very authoritative. And the slowdown comes in the middle person. I will have a lot to say about that later on. Now, it's interesting that you could, in this one, you could do a different kind of the same kind of profile. You could say the inner man is fixed, the middle man is fixed, and the outer man is fixed. So this represents that both the resistance and the insistence are all fixed, and it's not easy to change. And on top of that, Saturn is in the first house, which makes it hard for him to get things out. So instead of being a positive, negative, positive, you could say that it's a positive, negative, and a positive, negative, positive and negative for the ascendant. All right. Now, just a few minutes ago, we said that the moon is a kind of finalizer for all astrological influence. Now, I'm not a sun sign astrologer, but I do have to admit that the sun and the moon are highly influential, both in astrological and non-astrological things. After I keep a journal, a very one-line journal every day. I'm trying to understand the lunation cycle in greater detail yet. And after keeping that journal for a few years now, I'm convinced that the lunation cycle does set an astrological atmosphere. And all of the other influences that are in the air have to come to being or come to material finality through that atmosphere, through that lunation cycle. And so basically what test and profile number 17 are a indication of the atmosphere of the lunation cycle at birth. Very simple, not much to it at all. In the Freud horoscope, the moon is in the third day of the lunation cycle. And it's also at the first semi-sextile of the lunation cycle. And so on my conspectus sheet, what I put down is budding novelty. This is just about the time when at sunset you can first see the moon. Sometimes it's a little earlier than this, but this is the first time that at sunset you can see it. And there's that budding kind of quality. You know, the darkness of the new moon is all over. There's the power if you're coming in secret or in invisibility and you can't be seen. There's a great power in that. But the moon is now beginning to consolidate new life and new growth, and what was done in secret is now beginning to be visible. And that is the atmosphere into which he was born. Now his life does seem to be like that. This is very good for a founder. You don't just found it in the dark and leave it in the dark. You to some extent you have to bring it out into the world. And all right, We could cross-profile that with the other test, number 16, but that's a little too much. Now, in the Jung chart, the moon phase is 1 day past the last quarter. And my conspectus I put in there, dissolving structure is underway. Because if the first square is the consolidating square, the second square, which is what the last quarter of the moon is dissolving, or it's destructive. But it's in between the square and the sextile. And when it's in between the square and the sextile, it's between the whole process of breaking it down and the process of synthesizing. Sort of like if you wanted to, if you built a building of bricks and you wanted to be able to tell the nature of all those bricks the way they were, if you break the building down and separate all the bricks into individual pieces, there's no trace of a building left anymore, but you can see the commonality, how many bricks there are and how they're composed and things like that. And that's what that synthesis is like at the last sextile. And so that's what he was born under. And it's like all of the pins have been pulled out of everything, and the connections between everything are, you can see what they are without them having to be within a structure. Now, it's not so far after that last sextile. The last semi-sextile is when things collapse and when things go racing home to the next new moon. And so this is something like a harvesting of the old as things are intentionally brought into decadence. Again, this is what you have with analysis. You're taking things apart and things are automatically going into decadence. All right, this is as far as we're going to go. Next time I'll try to get this put into a form that's very readable so that you can use it. And the next time what we will do is we will first look at the broad generals, and you'll see why I used the words that I used in the conspectus, because it helps you understand the broad picture and hunks of the broad picture, and then we'll try to do some cross-profiling. And I hope to have all the books available to you on DVD so that you can so we'll have an assignment over summer that all of you will not do, but that's all right. All right, are there any questions in this?
Which action principle do you feel was most important?
I think that the intensity action principle is the most important. And that's why I laid such stress on the highly different, Carl Gustav Jung having so many intense aspects. Now, it varies from astrologer to astrologer. Most astrologers who see things as good and bad would take the quality test as the most important. How bad it all is or how good it all is, and I don't want to look at it that way. In fact, it really isn't that way.
And wasn't there an overlap with Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner? Didn't they live?
Yes, they knew each other.
They did.
They knew each other, and they had rapier sharp things to say about each other. I think Rudolf Steiner used a bad metaphor. He called the Freudian psychoanalysis, in print he did it, he called Freudian psychoanalysis and analytic psychology flowers of the swamp when they were actually developed in the Alps. And But they both understood each other well, and they had things to say about each other.
Yeah.
In fact, I think there's one thing that, talking about East versus West, that I'm sure that Jung got it from Steiner, because it's something that very few people would ever say. He says the difference between East and West is that the East watches thoughts and the West thinks thoughts. And that's a Steinerism, if anything. Max is like that also, makes that same kind of position. And from what Jung says about things Eastern, I don't want to get into it, but he's not highly consistent. Like in a big part of his life, he was anti-Eastern, and that's one of the things he accused Steiner of. He said, "Oh, it's all Eastern, it's all Hindu," but then he got interested in the I Ching, and suddenly the East looked very positive and inspiring. And it's a tough thing, because they're both great men, but both of them dislike mystics, and to try to keep a cool, even attitude about them if you're a mystic.
Yeah, I can't see what either of them would have had to do with Steiner.
Yeah. All right. That's it. You gonna go walking?
Terrible things to say.
I'm kind of tired. I think I'll pass.
Okay.
Go outside.
You up for walking?